Well, good morning, Journey Fellowship family. We're glad that this Memorial Day weekend you are worshiping with us. We are culminating, bringing in for a landing, if you will, the long traveling path that we have gone through the book of Colossians. We have been working at this, through this, since the very first week of February. And I don't know about you, but in some ways, February feels so far away. So much has sort of moved and changed, and we've got this fatigue of decisions and distance and all of that stuff. And in some ways, it feels so far away. And yet it also feels just yesterday. And so as we bring this in for a landing, I want to remind us of some things. Back in February, as we began this, we said to ourselves, here's Paul. Paul was a church planter, a missionary. He was someone who had been changed and transformed by the gospel. He was literally knocked off a horse by Jesus. And as he comes to faith, he becomes so passionate, the passion that he had persecuting the church. He was someone who was literally murdering Christians. He becomes that same sort of passion, that same sort of enthusiasm to spread the truth, overwhelms him in such a way that he becomes what many would say was the greatest missionary. He writes more than half of the New Testament. And this book that we've been looking at for these several months now, this book of Colossians, was written to a church in the town of Colossae, where Paul never was. In fact, what they were was his spiritual grandchildren. Right? Paul had, in the course of his travels, come and befriends the guy. The guy comes to faith in Jesus and then goes home. And when home, he himself plants a church, right? There's multiple people and families and individuals who come to faith in Jesus, and a church gets formed. And Paul has never been to Colossae. He's never actually physically met, right, the people that he's even writing to, but his heart for them, like a grandfather, right, he loves them and he cares about them, and he's calling them back to the gospel that they began to follow Jesus with, because this false idea, this false teaching and doctrine known as Gnosticism had begun to infiltrate the church. Gnosticism, at its sort of most fundamental, foundational level, says that matter, physical stuff you can touch, is bad. That only the spiritual stuff is good. And so it becomes a denial of the gospel, because it becomes a denial of the character, of the very nature of who Jesus was, that he was fully God and fully man. And so it's this indictment of the gospel that these people have been won to, and people begin to kind of creep into the church. False teachers come in, and they begin to go, no, you can't believe that. You've got to believe this. And so Paul was writing, much of the book was a correction of that. And what we've seen over these months and weeks is that Paul begins at sort of the big ideas of combating the Gnosticism, and then goes, this is what an actual follower of Jesus does. This is how they look like. This is how they function, that out of their being comes their doing. And so for the last several weeks, what we've been looking at is some specific illustrations of that. We began a couple weeks ago, we looked at marriage, right, of husbands and wives and kids and relationships. And we talked about how, right, if someone is being transformed as a follower of Jesus, it's going to impact the kind of husband that they are, the kind of wife that they are, the kind of kids that they are, the kind of parents that they are. And that really was just an illustration of relationships. That as we think about how am I in relationship with my neighbors and my friends and my co-workers, in relationship, it's going to matter that I'm a follower of Jesus. And then last week we said it's going to matter how I work, the kind of employee I am, the kind of way that I function inside of a church body. Ultimately, how I choose to love Jesus is going to be impacted because I'm his follower. That this following Jesus thing is going to get down into all of the nooks and crannies, every expression of our life. Everything about us changes because we know Jesus. As Paul is going to bring the letter to a close this morning, we're going to be looking at most of chapter 4. And the thing that I am struck by is he brings it to close. He wants to give these sort of parting words of wisdom. Paul's imprisoned. He knows that it is unlikely that he's ever going to physically see these people. And so he's calling to them. He's kind of giving them his parting words of wisdom. In Colossians chapter 4, we're going to read verses 2 through 6. Continue steadfastly in prayer. Notice the priority that he puts upon praying. Be watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us that God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. Verse 5, walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Right? We've seen that the followers of Jesus and their marriages and their families and their relationships are going to be different. In their work, as servants or slaves even, employees, bosses, maybe they're just mid-level management, right? Maybe you're a line worker, maybe you're a factory worker. However you work, it's going to all be impacted by Jesus. And then Paul says, right, he's come out of that, and now he says, listen, my parting words are, be someone who prays, pray with thanksgiving, and be ready to speak to the people who are on the outside, those who are outside of the family of God, those who we want, those who God himself wants to come inside to the family of God. So this morning, I want you to think, first of all, Paul is saying we should be praying for the open doors, right? He's saying that about himself. He's saying that to the church of Colossae. I think he's saying it to us here in the 21st century, that it will require us to actually open our mouths. It will require us to say the things that people need to hear. It's not enough to just be a good person. It's not enough to just do good stuff, but it's going to require that we actually use our voices and say, Jesus is the reason. Jesus has transformed me. And so speak clearly. Now, that's sort of more other weeks that we've talked about. This morning, what I really want to talk about is how do we walk in wisdom? How do we speak with wisdom to some varying groups of people? I've broken sort of the people that I've known and the encounters that I've had over these years into 4 sort of big groups of folks as we think about how do I live my life? How do I operate? How do I engage in conversations with people? Here are the 4 kinds of people, and I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a how do we engage these sorts of folks. The first, as we think about those outsiders, those outside the family, the first of those are, this is going to sound odd maybe, but I want you to think about church people. Now, here's what I mean by that. I am a professional church worker, right? I've been in pastoral ministry in local churches for better than 20 years. I have been in churches multiple places around the country. I've traveled literally around the globe doing missions work and all kinds of stuff. I've seen believers of all sort of shapes and sizes and colors and smells. And this is going to be hard to hear, but what I found is there's a group of people inside pretty much every church that I would call church people. And here's what I mean. These are people who attend, maybe they participate, they're active, they come to things, they do stuff. They might even be those who give $1 or $2 or 20 or 1,000. It's not just, they're hard to sort of qualify into this thing except in this way. They don't know Jesus. Sometimes they know they don't know Jesus, but in many ways, the more challenging ones don't even realize that they don't know Jesus. These folks need to hear things like when Jesus is teaching and he says, there's going to come a spot when I'm going to look at some folks and I'm going to say, depart from me, I don't ever know you. Right? Jesus himself says there's this group of people who have been on the edges, right? On the sort of intermingled in with the church, but they haven't actually ever been transformed by the gospel. Jesus warned these folks that it was possible to be physically around, even to do some of the things of the church, but not be the church. Maybe you've got a husband or a wife or your kids who are participating. And it's put you in and around, but you're not someone who has ever been transformed. They've never transferred the trust of their eternity and their life and their soul to Jesus. They're still trusting in something else. They might be trusting in that very church attendance, in that offering that they gave, in that Bible study that they attended, but they've never trusted Jesus' work on the cross for their salvation. Some questions as you engage, as you encounter, as you come across these sorts of folks. How do I get the conversation into the spot? Even maybe how do I diagnose this? The question you might ask is, how have you changed in the gospel lately? I would ask you this morning, if you are watching, to ask yourself that question. How have you been changed by the gospel? Not changed by guilt, not changed by shame, not changed by the nagging of your spouse. How has the truth of the gospel transformed you in the last 3 weeks, in the last 3 months? Where's the evidence that Jesus is moving or working in your life? Another question. This is an old famous, I think they're called the Kennedy questions. If you were to die today, and you stood in front of God, and he asked you, why should I let you into my heaven? What would you say? Would your answer be because I'm good, because I'm kind, because I've attended church, because my mom was a great Sunday school teacher? Those might be true, but they're not answers for why Jesus should let you into heaven. See, the answer, if it's anything other than because Jesus died for my sins and purchased my eternities, because I've rested the whole of who I am into his hands and into the finished work of Jesus on the cross. Anything else means you're probably in this church person category where you've tasted it in some ways, but you've never experienced the transformation of the gospel in your own life. There's church people. There's also what I will call angry atheists. And I've met very few, which is my polite way of saying I don't really know that I've ever met any atheists who arrived here as a result solely of intellectual sort of argument and path. Whether they're kids or teens, adults, folks want to believe in something. I think we're built and designed, shaped, imaged by God to desire something bigger than we are to worship. And so when folks get to the spot where that they don't believe that, they think there's nothing, it's usually, almost always, because they ultimately are doubting the very character of God. See, here's the thing. I don't think science disproves God, right? Folks often in this category want to use it that way. In fact, I think science tends to prove him. Gravity doesn't say there's no God. Gravity says we have a God of order. Gravity, right? Science says we have a God who created things in such a way that we can test them and prove them, and that what science is doing ultimately, it's in the process of revealing, here are the things that we can count to. Here's the economy of God in creation. So where we end up on the big questions, is there a God? Is he ultimately good? Has more to do with where we start. So when we come to it from a spot of, I've been hurt or harmed, I've got a reason to doubt his goodness, we can end up in these spots. So how do we engage? How do we have wise conversations? How do we point these kinds of conversations and the means and the methods into the places of the gospel? I think many ways what it requires is that we are empathetic and willing to listen. That we get through the pain and the hurt and sometimes the venom. Sometimes the attack on us and our faith. And we're willing to instead engage with empathy. How and where and how has this person hurt? How has this person been disappointed? How has this person's life story say to them, God must not be good? What happened to them to make them not believe? And ultimately, as we continue in that conversation, sometimes it takes time, right? These are not usually short conversations. They're spread out over time if they're going to usually be effective. We earn the right and the opportunity to say, don't you want someone to ultimately set those things right? Doesn't real justice require that there is an accounting for the harm that was done? And it's in the context of those conversations that we can point to a good God, to a Jesus himself who bore the weight of that sin and that shame and that harm, that we and they might ultimately have hope. Well, there's church people, there's angry atheists, there's also fence-sitting agnostics. They're usually folks who would say, spirituality is okay. I believe something, but I'm not sure what or why I believe. And sometimes, right, in these conversations, what we want to have is, where's truth? These folks, there are many of these, probably more in terms of category, more of these folks than the other three. And often for these folks, the conversation turns on, is there truth? And can it be absolute? Or is everything just subjective, because that is what our culture is saying to us? And again, in the course of those conversations, what I've found is it's helpful to start to move out of the sort of big giant ideas down into the personal ideas. See, it's one thing to say that who are we to decide what is right or wrong for everybody else until someone punches me in the nose and takes my $20. See, when it impacts us, when we can take conversations from big ideas into personal spots, we can begin to say that no, there are things that are true. There are things that we believe. There are things that are true for everyone. And in the course of those conversations, we can start to turn the conversation. Again, in our culture, we've been trained to believe, from television and movies and music and media and advertising and almost everything is saying to us, everybody gets to believe what they want to believe. Just you don't get to create some binary choice for me. You don't get to make me pick between your two things. But isn't that in and of itself a binary choice? Isn't you can't make me do this, you believe this and I believe that? Isn't that in and of itself a binary choice? Now, the irony of that, I want to tell a joke, but nobody's in the room with me to laugh. And so here on the internet, we're just going to have to chuckle to ourselves at the irony of creating a binary choice that says there aren't any binary choices. How do we engage these folks? Again, some of the things I've found over time, and you want to start to talk about beauty. You want to start to talk about good and right and wrong. How do we decide those things? And if we have to decide, if we are put in the spot where we have to choose between binary things, who gets to decide? Is it possible for, right? Sometimes we come to sort of democratic places, but isn't it possible even for the masses to be wrong? And if there is a God, if he is a good God, if he is a holy God, and if that good, holy, perfect God has chosen to reveal himself, shouldn't we trust his word to reveal him to us? Again, often these conversations come to spots of, what does love really mean? What does it really mean to be gracious? And we end up using our human definitions and our human understandings of these things instead of his understandings and his definitions. And so we want to point these folks to passages where God himself defines who he is. Here's our fourth category of folks. The fourth category of folks is that they're good people. They're not agnostics or atheists or churchgoers. They're just good guys. They're just nice people. They're just the lady that lives across the street from you. They're real friends. They're the sort of people, right, who are faithful to their spouse and they don't cheat on their taxes, and they might volunteer to be a youth sports coach. They're the kind of person where if you break your leg and they're your neighbor, they're going to offer to come and mow your grass. They're just good people. And what has typically often happened to them is they engage in comparison. They look at themselves and their right and their goodness, and they go, well, I know I'm better than them. I don't cheat on my taxes. I don't cheat on my spouse. I don't beat my children. I don't deal drugs, right? I'm not a murderer. And they go, there's this category of people here, and I know that I'm better than they are. I'm a good person. So why do I need this gospel? Why do I need this Jesus? And often they use language like, that's for those who are weak, or that's for those who are desperate, or that's for those whose moms took them when they were kids, and they don't see their own personal need for Jesus. These conversations often turn on ideas of justice and holiness. How much wrong can a perfect, holy God allow into his presence? There's an old famous illustration that if you're making an omelet and you're cracking a bunch of eggs for a giant family, right? You're making scrambled eggs or an omelet for the family, and you're 10, 12, 13 eggs in, and all of a sudden you crack the bloody one into the pot. You're not going to use them, right? The one egg is sufficient to go, I'm not going to use them. Or if you've got a drink, it might be a big drink on a hot day. It might be, right, maybe you've got the big jug and it is sweaty outside, and aren't we thankful, many of us, that those warm, sunny days are coming soon. And you're thirsty and you're going for your drink, and someone leans over and snorks up a good old loogie and spits it in there. You're not going to measure it out. You're not going to go, well, it's not a big enough loogie for me to still, right? You're going to go, it ruins the whole thing. And in that way, as we think about our sinfulness, even for the good folks, if you can have the conversation, will acknowledge they're not perfect. Sure, they may have a stray thought. Sure, they may have looked at someone who wasn't their spouse in this sort of way. Sure, they may have just told like a white lie. They may not cheat on their taxes, but they may have just taken advantage of this thing over here. What do we do with those sins that we can see? What do we do with the little white lies? What do we do with the stuff we have allowed into our lives when no one else was watching and looking? And if we can engage folks in a way where they will be honest enough with us to say, yes, there is brokenness in my life. There is darkness in my past. And ultimately, then, what can I do to eradicate that debt that has been created? How can I pay it? How can I, in front of a holy God who demands perfection, claim perfection? How do I get myself back to zero? As you engage in those conversations, I pray that you would use your mouths, that you would use words, that you would share Jesus. That's what Paul is encouraging the church at Colossae and ultimately us to be about. At the end, he does something really interesting. As he brings the letter to a close, Paul begins to name names. He names people like Aristarchus and Mark. He names Epaphras and Luke, Nympha, the people at Laodicea, right? What's that last guy's name? Archippus. Some of those names we've heard before, and many of them we haven't. And I think what Paul was doing, what he was saying to us is, the gospel changes real people. These were people who, previous to the gospel, were lost. Previous to the gospel, previous to their encounter, previous to their following of Jesus, were those who had brokenness and darkness in their past. They're normal people. They're people that the others in the church would have known, right? These are husbands and wives and kids and folks they've worked with, someone you would have seen in the marketplace. And they're now the people that you're sitting next to in worship. They're the people you're going to break bread with. These are the folks just like the ones we've been talking about. Folks who had been far from Jesus, stuck in their darkness and brokenness, who didn't believe, who weren't walking and following. Maybe they were atheists, maybe they were agnostics, maybe they were people who were at the fringes of the church, maybe they were just good neighbors. But in a moment, because someone shares Christ with them, they are transformed. Something, and that something is Jesus and the cross, brings them out of the darkness and into the light. And notice that doesn't mean they've become superheroes. It doesn't mean that they all become missionaries and pastors and gospel writers, though some of them do. They're still in prison. They're still slaves. They're still wives and husbands. They still have to get up and go to work and raise their kids and figure out how to pay the bills. They're everyday people who have now been changed by the gospel, just like you and I. See, we've been given the beautiful, amazing truth of the gospel. May it change us. May it mold us. May it shape us. May, as we have looked over these weeks and months, may we see the mysterious, beautiful, majestic truth that Christ is in us and that it is Him that is the hope of glory. And that it is as we root our lives, as we dig the fingers of us, as we bury us into Him, we root ourselves in Jesus, that we are transformed. That out of our being flows our doing, that we as well might be listed in a list of names like this. We could say them and we could go, here's this person, and here's the way they're serving. Here's this person, and they're doing this great and good stuff. Here's this person, and we could do that. And your name and my name might be listed in this sort of a list. May we be folks who can see that our past, its darkness, its brokenness has been left behind. And that where we are is those with futures full of light and hope and joy. Friends, I pray that as you engage, as you use your mouths to have conversations with folks about Jesus, about the gospel, that you would do it in wisdom. I'm praying for you as you engage them. And that we would also see ourselves. We would remind ourselves that we are people with a past who have been redeemed and transformed. That it allows us to engage and encounter folks, not as those who have got it all together, but as those who are being transformed into the very image of Jesus. Friends, I'm praying for you this week. Would you walk and operate in wisdom? I love you. I look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great week.